I want you to picture this in your head for a second.
Oh, I love a good visual. Set the scene.
Okay, so it is the early 1930s, and we are in this super remote rural village in Manchuria.
Right.
It's a harvest festival. So the air is thick with, the smell of roasting meats, and there's dust getting kicked up everywhere by hundreds of feet.
Just total chaos.
Total chaos. It's the overwhelming noise of a community celebrating that they survived another year.
Yeah.
But in the middle of all this joy, there is this massive, completely drunken Mongolian Bokh wrestler.
Oh, man. Okay, for anyone listening who is unfamiliar with Mongolian Bokh, we are not talking about, like, a modern Olympic wrestler here.
Not at all.
We are talking about human mountains. I mean, Bokh is a jacket wrestling style, so that means they aren't just grabbing sweaty skin, they are grabbing thick, heavy fabric.
Which changes the leverage completely, right?
Exactly. It develops this terrifying, vice-like grip and just crushing torque. Their entire anatomical structure, the thick joints, massive core strength, low center of gravity, it is all built for absolute, uncompromising leverage.
And this particular giant is just completely ruining the festival. He is heavily intoxicated, throwing his immense weight around, knocking people over, basically disrespecting the locals.
Sounds terrifying.
Yeah, the villagers are terrified. I mean, he is a biological tank, and nobody can stop him. But then, out of this panicked crowd, steps this frail, elderly Korean man.
Just a random older guy.
Literally a guy who looks so brittle that a stiff breeze might knock him over. And the giant wrestler sees him, laughs, and just lunges forward to crush him.
Naturally.
But what happens next defies all apparent logic. The elderly man doesn't, try to muscle out of the grip.
Because he couldn't anyway.
Right. Instead, he effortlessly drops the giant with a single strike. And it's so fast and so mechanically perfect that the people watching can barely even process it.
Wow.
1 second, the giant is lunging, and the next second, he is completely unconscious in the dirt. And the old man is just standing there, barely even breathing hard.
And see, what's wild is that this isn't a scene from some martial arts movie.
Nope, this actually happened.
It is a recorded historical event. And crucially, it was witnessed by this wide-eyed 9-year-old boy standing in that crowd.
A boy who would grow up to be pretty important.
Yeah, that boy was Choi Young-yu, who you might actually know by the name he adopted much later in life, which is Mas Oyama.
A legend himself.
The legendary founder of Kyokushin Karate, which is arguably the most brutal, full-contact martial art in the world.
In that single moment in the dust of Manchuria, that is our inciting incident today.
It's where it all starts.
So our mission for this deep dive is to take this massive stack of sources we've got. I mean, we are looking at bureaucratic historical documents from the Government General of Korea, esoteric martial arts treatises, and some really deep cultural analyses from Japan.
It's a heavy stack of reading.
It really is. But we're using all of it to uncover the lost art that this old man was using, an art known as Chakuriki, or borrowed power. Okay, let's unpack this.
And I just want to jump in and say the stakes here go way beyond just, historical curiosity.
Oh, absolutely.
We are tracing a lineage of violence and survival. We're going to look at how this obscure, highly esoteric Korean mountain folk religion, which was originally rooted in animist magic and wilderness survival, somehow traversed oceans, survived cultural erasure, and became the actual biomechanical foundation for global combat sports.
The sports we watch today on TV.
Exactly. We are talking about the roots of Kyokushin Karate and the terrifying efficiency of modern Dutch kickboxing.
So if you're listening, I want you to just strip away everything you think you know about modern sanitized combat sports.
Forget the bright stadium lights.
Yeah, forget the padded 4-ounce gloves, the sports commissions, the scorecards, the fancy ice baths. We need to go back to the raw, unfiltered wilderness roots of human power.
And to do that, you really have to look through the eyes of that 9-year-old boy.
Seeing that frail elder use Chakuriki, it permanently altered young Mas Oyama's understanding of kinetic power.
Right, because he realized in an instant that true lethal strength had absolutely nothing to do with having massive biceps.
Or looking like a bodybuilder.
Exactly. But the story of Chakuriki doesn't just stay in the 1930s.
No, it goes dormant for a bit.
Yeah. To understand what Oyama actually spent his life chasing, we have to fast forward to a very specific cultural moment in 1969.
Because for decades, Chakuriki was basically a ghost. It was just a whisper, like this memory locked in Oyama's mind. But then in 1969, it violently explodes into the public consciousness in Japan.
Enter a man named Rikibasan.
Rikibasan arrives in the country, and he does not come quietly.
No, he is bold. He claims to be a grandmaster of Chakuriki, and he goes on national Japanese television to demonstrate it to this post-war public that is just, well, they're hungry for spectacle.
And he causes an absolute nationwide sensation. Looking at the archival footage and the descriptions from our sources, the superhuman feats he did left audiences totally stunned.
Oh, they are wild.
Like Rikibasan would have a thick glass beer bottle tossed super high into the air, and he would shatter it midair with a bare fist.
Which, I mean, from a pure physics standpoint, that is incredibly difficult to even conceptualize.
Because the bottle isn't anchored to anything, right?
Right. Hitting a moving, unanchored object with enough blunt force to actually shatter thick glass before the kinetic energy just pushes the bottle away.
It's like trying to punch a balloon and pop it instead of just launching it.
Exactly. That requires an absurd transfer of impulse. The speed and the structural alignment of the striking limb have to be, well, virtually perfect.
And he didn't stop there. He also stood completely relaxed, arms down, and allowed professional heavyweight boxers to deliver full-force, bare-knuckle punches directly into his solar plexus.
And he wouldn't even blink.
Not a flinch. He crushed solid concrete blocks with his bare hands. The sources even note he publicly challenged Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali to a bare-knuckle bout.
Just to prove a point.
Yeah, explicitly to prove that a heavyweight champion boxer's punch simply could not damage his internal structure.
I mean, it sounds mythological.
It does.
And honestly, the martial arts community in Japan at the time had the exact same skepticism that you probably have right now listening to this.
Well, let's dive into that skepticism for a second, because I'm looking at these feats, breaking a bottle midair, taking a bunch to the gut, and it just screams parlor tricks to me.
Yeah, very Houdini.
Right. It sounds like a circus strongman act from the 1920s. We've all seen stage magicians who use applied physics to fake invulnerability.
They know the exact weak point of the glass bottle.
Exactly. Or they use a diaphragmatic vacuum to tense their abdominal wall at the precise millisecond of impact, dispersing the kinetic energy. So it begs the question, was Rikibasan just a highly skilled illusionist playing to a gullible 1960s TV audience?
I mean, that skepticism was everywhere. But what's fascinating here is Rikibasan's underlying philosophy. The actual physiological theory he preached to explain these feats is what captivated the martial arts world.
What was his explanation?
He explicitly stated that Chakuriki did not build muscle mass. He wasn't lifting weights to induce hypertrophy.
So no deadlifts.
No deadlifts. He also claimed it didn't rely on building dense, dead calluses on the knuckles, which is a huge departure because that was the standard practice for traditional karate practitioners.
Right. They would spend hours punching wooden makiwara boards just to deaden their nerve ending.
Exactly. But if you aren't building muscle fiber and you aren't killing the nerves in your hands, how are you shattering concrete?
That is the million-dollar question.
He argued it was about absolute internal optimization, manipulating the nervous system, the breath, and the structural integrity of the skeletal system to a degree that seems, honestly, biologically impossible to an untrained person.
And we actually have secondary evidence that this internal power wasn't just a TV gimmick for Rikibasan.
We do.
Mas Oyama himself, who we know was heavily influenced by that childhood memory of Chakuriki, was famously known to perform similar internal feats behind closed doors.
His party trick.
Yeah. As a party trick, Oyama would take a solid copper 10-yen coin, hold it merely between his thumb and index finger, and bend it in half.
Just with the pinch grip. I mean, let's think about the anatomy of that for a second.
Please break it down, because it hurts my hands to even think about.
The flexor tendons in the forearm operate the fingers like puppet strings. To generate enough localized force to exceed the yield strength of solid copper using just the tips of 2 digits without snapping your own pulleys or fracturing the distal phalanges.
It's terrifying.
It is horrifying if you apply that same pinch grip to, say, a human rib or a clavicle.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And Rikibasan claimed that feats like bending coins with the fingers were absolute proof of Chakuriki's internal power.
It was a demonstration of connective tissue strength, bone density, and internal energy focused into a single millimeter-precise point. It wasn't about big muscles at all. It was about structural perfection.
Which naturally brings up the biggest question for anyone listening.
How do you learn it?
Exactly. If Rikibasan's feats were purely internal, how does a normal human being actually acquire this borrowed power? Like, what does a Tuesday morning training session even look like?
To understand the training, we have to look at the literal translation of the word itself.
Okay.
The word chakuriki is just the Japanese pronunciation of the Korean term shakryok. The literal translation of the characters means utilizing power outside of oneself.
So external power.
Yes. And Rikibasan taught that the concept of borrow in this context is actually a dual mechanism. There are two parts to it.
Let's break down those two mechanisms.
The first meaning is to help. This refers to drawing out the latent physical and mental potential that is sleeping within the practitioner's own biology.
The idea that we leave a lot of potential on the table.
Exactly. The prevailing philosophy, and we actually still see variations of this in modern sports psychology, was that ordinary humans only use about 10% of their inherent capabilities.
Right.
Their willpower, their courage, and the actual recruitment of their muscle fibers are all capped by the brain to prevent self-injury. Rikibasan said Chakuriki helps the body access that dormant 90%.
It's essentially hacking the Golgi tendon reflex. I mean, in modern biology, we know about hysterical strength, like those famous stories of a mother lifting a 3,000-pound car off a trapped child.
Right, in a panic state.
Normally, your nervous system actively inhibits maximum muscle contraction because if your muscles fired at 1%, they would literally tear themselves off the bone or snap your tendons. The brain acts as a safety switch.
And Rikibasan is suggesting that Chakuriki training allows you to consciously override that biological safety switch without destroying your own body.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. You are safely accessing emergency power reserves.
That's the first meaning. The second meaning of the character is literally to borrow, and this is where it ventures into the highly esoteric.
Get ready for the weird stuff.
Rikibasan claimed this meant absorbing and utilizing the subtle life energy from nature and the universe itself. He called this energy siso, or essence. Yeah. He taught that it flows through human nerves, and controlling it produces extraordinary reflexes and explosive power. If we look at the broader Asian martial and spiritual landscape, this concept is essentially identical to the idea of chakras in Indian yogic traditions or meridians and qi in Chinese traditional medicine.
So you are not a closed biological loop. You are an open system interacting with your environment, and if you align your physical structure correctly, you can channel the environment's kinetic energy.
And Rikibasan outlined 3 distinct systems of training to achieve this state. The 3 pillars.
Let's hear them.
The first pillar is Shin, which translates to spirit. And this is completely removed from the concept of a modern gym.
No treadmills.
None. This is about absolute terrifying seclusion. The practitioner goes deep into the remote, unforgiving mountains, completely isolating themselves from human contact.
Wow.
They master complex diaphragmatic breathing techniques, and they undergo severe austerities. The most famous one is standing motionless under freezing mountain waterfalls to forge an unbreakable will.
Okay, from a physiological standpoint, standing under a freezing waterfall is fascinating because you are triggering the mammalian dive reflex and an intense cold shock response.
Your body thinks it's dying.
Your vagus nerve is literally screaming at your brain that you are dying, inducing panic and hyperventilation. The Shin training is about using breath and willpower to manually override your autonomic nervous system.
You're forcing your heart rate to drop.
Yes, forcing your mind to achieve stillness while your body is just hammered by freezing trauma.
It is a radical subjugation of the panic reflex. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is Yaku, or medicine.
Medicine in the wilderness.
Yes. This deals with the internal chemistry of the practitioner. You are surviving in the wilderness, so you have to sustain your life and alter your bodily chemistry using only what you can forage.
Like what?
Wild mountain herbs, tree bark, specific nuts, and wild fruits. It's a form of extreme dietary optimization and fasting.
Driving the body into deep ketosis.
Exactly. Forcing cellular autophagy just to survive in a harsh environment.
And then we arrive at the third pillar, which is the physical manifestation of the power. Ren, or practice.
The brutal part.
Very. This is the physical conditioning. Accounts describe practitioners striking the trunks of massive trees, leaping over jagged rocks and mountain gorges, and breaking river stones with their bare hands and feet.
Now, when a modern person hears about someone breaking river stones or punching trees, it sounds like primitive self-mutilation, right?
It sounds incredibly counterproductive, like you're just going to break your hand.
Exactly. But modern sports science and orthopedics actually provide the exact mechanism for why this works.
Yeah, let's dig into Wolff's Law here, because this is a foundational concept discovered by German anatomist Julius Wolff in the 19th century.
It explains everything.
It does. Wolff's Law states that bone in a healthy person or animal will adapt to the specific loads under which it is placed.
Meaning, if the loading on a particular bone increases, the bone will remodel itself over time to become stronger.
So when you punch a tree, you aren't just callousing the skin. You are systematically causing microfractures in the internal architecture of the bone, the trabeculae.
And when the body detects those microfractures, osteoblasts rush to the site to repair the damage. And here's the key. They don't just repair it back to baseline.
They overcompensate.
They build it back denser and thicker. The external cortical portion of the bone literally calcifies into a harder structure.
So over years of doing this in the mountains, you are fundamentally altering your skeletal density. You are turning your forearms and knuckles into literal hardened weapons.
And when you combine that hardened weapon with the concept of borrowing power biomechanically, you get that old man dropping the giant wrestler.
Think about the physics of a whip. When you snap a leather whip, the tip breaks the sound barrier, right?
He creates a sonic boom.
But the kinetic energy didn't come from the very tip of the whip. It came from the handle, traveling like a wave through a perfectly aligned structure.
Rikibasan was basically teaching the human body to become that whip.
Exactly. If you throw a punch using just the isolation of your tricep and front deltoid, you're using your own localized power. And honestly, it's weak.
It won't drop a giant.
But if you sink your stance, push off the ground with your heel, rotate your hips, snap your thoracic spine, and drop your entire center of mass at the exact millisecond of impact.
You aren't hitting the opponent with your arm anymore.
No. You are perfectly syncing your skeletal mass with the gravitational pull of the entire planet beneath your feet. You are quite literally borrowing the mass of the Earth to hit your opponent.
It is flawless biomechanical kinetic linking, but, wrapped in the language of mountain mysticism.
Right.
And Rikibasan explicitly stated that practitioners had to train this way out of pure necessity. Because they were living in the remote, wild mountains of the Korean peninsula, they weren't training for sport.
They weren't preparing for a boxing match.
No, they were training to fight off wild bears, wolves, leopards, and Siberian tigers. Yeah, he claimed there were specific, lethal self-defense techniques in Chakuriki designed exclusively for fighting wild beasts.
But, and this is important, there is a massive catch to Rikibasan's story. A glaring absence in his entire 1969 presentation that really makes you stop and scratch your head.
Oh, the missing piece.
Yeah. Despite all of his incredible demonstrations, the shattering glass bottles, the crushed concrete, the iron stomach, Rikibasan never once demonstrated Chakuriki as a systematic sparring or combat method against another human being.
None of the sources show him actually fighting a person.
There are no Chakuriki forms. There's no shadow boxing. There's no footwork for slipping a jab or defending a takedown.
Which naturally brings us to a historical crossroads.
Yeah.
If there were no systematic combat forms, if it was just about surviving extreme cold, fasting, and punching trees to fight off bears.
Was Chakuriki even a martial art at all?
Right, or was it something fundamentally different that just happened to produce devastating physical power as a side effect?
To find the truth, we really have to bypass Rikibasan's highly theatrical television persona. We have to go back decades further and dig into the actual historical archives.
The real documents.
And the sources we have for this are fascinating because they are not martial arts scrolls. They are incredibly dry, bureaucratic documents compiled by the Government General of Korea during the Japanese colonial period.
And what these hard administrative documents reveal is a massive paradigm shift.
Tell me about it.
Historically, in its original native context, Chakuryoke was not a fighting style. It wasn't a martial art. Not at all. It was a folk animistic belief system deeply rooted in Korean shamanism, and it functioned as a highly structured system of magic.
Magic. I love this pivot. Let's unpack the archives and see how the government officials categorized this magic. What were these mountain ascetics actually doing out there?
So the government texts categorized Chakuriki into 4 distinct types of what they called dependent faith.
Dependent faith.
Meaning the practitioner is relying on external spiritual energy to achieve a real-world result. And this was most commonly used to ward off evil spirits and cure diseases in rural communities.
So they were healers.
Basically. The first type is shinjak, which means borrowing from the gods. The second is yakujak, borrowing from medicine. The third is ninjak, borrowing from people. And the fourth is butsujak, borrowing from objects.
Okay, so if I am a peasant farmer in a rural Korean village in the 1800s, and my child falls deathly ill with a fever, I am not looking for a martial artist to go punch a tiger.
No, you don't need a fighter.
I am looking for a Chakuriki practitioner to come to my home and perform a ritual.
And the sources detail these local healing rituals with incredible specificity.
What's an example?
For example, to utilize ninjak borrowing from people, a practitioner might walk through a village and collect small pieces of rice cake from exactly 10 different households.
Okay, specific.
Then they would have the sick person eat those rice cakes, operating under the animistic belief that they were borrowing the collective life force and vitality of the community to heal the patient.
Wow. Or they might use butsujak, borrowing from objects. I was reading that the archives mention hanging a heavy iron padlock from a sick child's sash.
Yes, the padlock ritual.
The conceptual magic there is that you are locking the child's soul inside their body to prevent a demonic disease from dragging it away.
It's deeply symbolic.
They even detail rituals, like smearing a dog's blood on the main gate of a village to repel malevolent spiritual forces during a plague.
It is raw, elemental animism. It is the deep-seated belief that spiritual energy permeates all things, rice cakes, iron padlocks, animal blood, and that a skilled practitioner can manipulate that energy.
But the core question is, how does someone become qualified to manipulate this energy? How do you earn the right to perform this magic?
That is where the intense physical trials come in. To achieve shinjak, the direct borrowing of divine power, a seeker had to undergo a 100-day mountain trial.
100 days alone.
They would leave society entirely and isolate themselves in the most dangerous, remote peaks of the peninsula. They would purify themselves through extreme fasting and exposure to the elements, all while facing what the historical texts describe as terrifying hallucinatory ordeals.
Let's consider the neurology of what happens to a human being during a 100-day mountain isolation.
It's a recipe for madness.
You are combining profound sleep deprivation with starvation diets, usually just eating pine needles or tree bark, and extreme cold exposure. You are depriving the brain of external stimuli and basic caloric function. The brain's default mode network begins to break down.
You are absolutely going to hallucinate.
The documents say these ascetics were tested by terrifying visions. They would experience apocalyptic thunderstorms, the ground shaking with earthquakes, the roaring of giant beasts circling their camp.
And even vivid, seductive visions of fine wine and beautiful women appearing out of nowhere, trying to tempt them to break their fast and flee the mountain.
It's an absolute psychological crucible designed to just break the ego completely.
And those very, very few who actually survived this 100-day ordeal without losing their minds, without dying of exposure or starvation, they were utterly transformed.
They came back different.
They returned to the villages and were given a specific title. They were called Tongyongja, which translates to spiritually connected persons. Because they had emptied themselves out through suffering, they were believed to have become pure vessels for the mountain's power. They could freely command spiritual forces.
So, synthesizing all of this historical data, the frail old man that the 9-year-old Mas Oyama saw in Manchuria, the guy who dropped the giant Bokh wrestler with an invisible strike.
Yeah.
He wasn't doing a Korean version of MMA.
Not at all.
He wasn't a professional prize fighter. He was a Tongyongja.
Yes.
He was a mountain shaman. He was a guy who had optimized his physical structure and his mental resilience so perfectly for raw survival in the freezing wilderness, who had forged his bone density through Wolff's Law and perfected his kinetic alignment through sheer necessity, that dealing with a drunken, untrained human wrestler felt like a minor inconvenience.
It wasn't a fight to him.
No, it was just applied physics.
That is the profound historical synthesis of Chakuriki. It was never designed as a combat system against humans. It was an animistic survival system that produced combat-applicable superhuman biomechanics purely as a byproduct of trying not to die in the mountains.
Which is just incredible to think about.
But there is a deep tragedy embedded in this history. During the Japanese colonial period in Korea, which lasted for 35 years from 1910 to 1945, the occupying authorities actively suppressed indigenous Korean culture, language, and folk beliefs.
The archives note that native martial arts like Taekyon were driven completely underground, and these mountain ascetics, these shamans, rapidly declined due to systemic persecution.
The tradition of Chakuriki was nearly wiped off the face of the earth.
It was almost entirely erased from the Korean peninsula. But, and this is where the historical irony is staggering to me, the exact same type of mountain mysticism, the exact same animistic survival practices existed natively over in Japan.
Yes, a perfect parallel.
And this deeply entrenched Japanese mirror image would provide the perfect, fertile soil to take that Korean seed planted in young Oyama's head and grow it into a global phenomenon.
We really have to shift our focus to the Japanese mirror here, because if you want to understand the evolution of Japanese martial arts, if you want to understand the soul of the samurai or modern Budo, you can't just look at the battlefields.
You have to look at the mountains.
We are talking about Shugendo. This is an ancient, highly syncretic Japanese religion. It seamlessly blends the indigenous Shinto worship of nature and mountain spirits with the intense esoteric practices of Vajrayana Buddhism.
Like the Tendai and Shingon sects.
Exactly, the ones imported from mainland Asia. The practitioners of Shugendo are called the Yamabushi, which translates literally to those who prostrate themselves in the mountains, or basically, mountain ascetics.
The connection between the Yamabushi and Japanese martial arts, or Budo, is profound. As the cultural sources point out, Japanese martial arts are entirely unique in the global landscape because they evolved from pure, pragmatic killing techniques into spiritual systems intended for human development.
It's a huge shift.
Right. You don't send your kid to a local boxing gym to learn profound spiritual etiquette and self-actualization, but in Japan, you send them to a Budo dojo for exactly that reason. And that leap from violence to spiritual transformation is deeply tied to the practices of the Yamabushi.
When you look at the physical austerities of the Yamabushi, they're practically a one-to-one mirror of the Korean Chakuriki trials. It is uncanny.
Give us some examples.
Well, the Yamabushi practice Takigyo, which is standing under freezing, pounding waterfalls to purify the mind and body.
Just like the shin pillar of Chakuriki.
Exactly. They also practice Kaihogyo. This involves circumambulating jagged mountain peaks, hiking dozens of miles a day in straw sandals for months or even years on end.
The Tendai marathon monks of Mount Hei are famous for this.
They push the human body to the absolute point of physical and mechanical breakdown, purely to conquer the fear of death and realize the impermanence of the body.
And the sleep deprivation. The sources mention the practice of Sangamori.
Sangamori are sleepless vigils held in pitch-black mountain caves. You sit in absolute darkness without sleep for days.
Again, triggering the hallucinations.
The sensory deprivation forces the brain to create intense auditory and visual hallucinations. It is designed to force the practitioner to confront and conquer their own inner demons. They also practice hiwatari, which is literally walking barefoot across beds of blazing embers, utilizing intense focus to suppress the brain's pain receptors.
I often compare the Yamabushi to modern extreme ultramarathoners or Navy SEALs going through Hell Week.
That's a good analogy.
The physiological demands on the body, the sleep deprivation, the cold exposure, the caloric deficit, the stress on the joints are very similar. But the core motivation is entirely different.
It's not about combat dominance.
Right. A Navy SEAL is enduring that pain for combat dominance, mental toughness, and military mission success. An ultramarathoner is pushing athletic limits for personal achievement, but the Yamabushi is driven entirely by the goal of spiritual enlightenment.
They are enduring this agony to gain magical power, what they call chibuku, or subjugation, to repel evil spirits, heal the sick, and purify the land.
It is the exact same goal as the Korean Chakuriki shamans.
And this brings us to the central figure in their belief system, the patron deity of the Yamabushi, Fudo Myo-o.
Fudo Myo-o is one of the most striking visual figures in all of Japanese Buddhism. If you see a statue of him, he is terrifying to look at.
Intimidating for sure.
He is a wisdom king, usually depicted surrounded by a halo of raging fire with a furious fanged expression glaring down at humanity, and in his hands he holds a heavy rope and a double-edged sword.
But this is crucial to understanding the philosophy of Japanese martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
The sword Fudo Myo-o holds is not a weapon for killing human enemies on a battlefield.
It's a purely symbolic weapon.
It is the sword of wisdom. Its sole divine purpose is to cut through human ignorance, to sever the practitioner's own earthly desires, and to slay the inner demons of ego, fear, and attachment.
That is beautiful.
When a Yamabushi carries a sword into the mountains, they conceptually overlap it with Fudo Myo-o's sword. They aren't carrying a weapon of war. They are carrying a spiritual tool to violently cut their own hearts open and achieve absolute purity.
Now, the sources provide a really fascinating dark contrast to this, just to illustrate what happens when you use that raw mountain energy for malicious purposes instead of purification.
The darker magic.
They detail the darker side of Japanese folklore, specifically a notorious curse ritual called Ushinokoku Mairi.
the shrine visit at the hour of the ox.
Yes. This is a famous curse ritual where a person, usually driven by intense jealousy, vengeance, or hatred, goes to a Shinto shrine in the dead of night wearing white with candles bound to their head.
Super creepy imagery.
They take a straw gall, which contains the hair or blood of their target, and they hammer it into the shrine's sacred tree with long iron nails.
It is the ultimate spiritual desecration. The shrine is supposed to be a pure, protected domain of the gods, and the sacred tree is the central barrier holding back chaos.
By driving iron nails into it, you are actively, physically rebelling against the gods. You are attempting to manipulate raw, chaotic, raging energy, what the Japanese call oni or demonic energy, to do your dirty work and destroy your enemy.
It is the exact polar opposite of what the Yamabushi are doing with Fudo Myo's sword. The Yamabushi endure pain to purify themselves and the world. The curse maker tries to destroy the world through malice.
It perfectly illustrates how seriously this culture takes the physical manipulation of unseen energy. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to piece this history together?
Well, it means that in East Asia, historically, the line between a secluded, chanting monk and a lethal, combat-ready warrior is basically non-existent.
They are one and the same.
The extreme physical hardening required to achieve spiritual enlightenment naturally inevitably produces a body capable of devastating, terrifying violence.
And that realization is the key that unlocks our entire story. We have this intense, ascetic Japanese mountain culture, this Shugendo tradition, providing the perfect, fertile environment.
The perfect soil.
But how does the seed of that Korean Chakuriki memory, the memory of the old man dropping the giant, which has been planted in the mind of young Mas Oyama, actually take root and grow in this Japanese soil? He doesn't just wake up in Tokyo one day and invent Kyokushin Karate out of thin air.
He is heavily shaped and guided. The forging of Mas Oyama requires the perfect mentors, and the historical sources point to two monumental figures in post-war Japan who became his defining teachers.
Let's delve into these mentors. The first is a man named Sonichu.
Sonichu is a fascinating, complex, and often overlooked giant in martial arts history. Like Oyama, he was born in Korea and emigrated to Japan. He was an absolute physical powerhouse, a ninth dan in Goju-ryu karate, known for his immense physical strength, and a high-level expert in judo.
When you dig into Sonichu's past, you uncover this incredibly intense socio-political reality in post-war Japan. And to be clear to anyone listening, we are impartially reporting the historical facts from the sources here. We are not taking sides or endorsing any political ideology.
Right, just looking at the context.
But understanding the politics of the era is vital to understanding why Oyama's training was so brutal.
The historical record shows that Nichu was deeply involved in radical politics. In his youth, he was sympathetic to Marxist ideology, which actually landed him in detention with the Japanese authorities before the war.
And then he completely shifted gears.
Later in life, he pivoted and became deeply devoted to the Greater East Asia Federation ideology, a right-wing nationalist movement spearheaded by military figures like Kanji Ishiwara.
So you had this incredibly intense, politically radicalized man teaching martial arts. And the timing is critical. This is immediately following World War II. Japan is a shattered nation, completely under the occupation of the Allied GHQ, the general headquarters led by Douglas MacArthur.
And one of the first things GHQ does is issue a blanket ban on the practice of all Japanese martial arts.
Everything. Judo, kendo, karate, they ban it all.
Viewing these arts as inherently militaristic and dangerous to the democratization of Japan.
But Sonichu and his colleagues found a brilliant legal loophole. Because they were technically Korean nationals, not Japanese citizens, they were able to operate a dojo under the banner of the Korean Youth League.
A sanctuary, basically.
It became a GHQ-proof underground training ground where martial arts could be practiced openly, aggressively, and brutally away from the eyes of the occupying forces. And it was in this pressure cooker of an environment that young Mas Oyama trained under Sonichu.
It's an incredible historical pivot point. Oyama is learning how to fight in a room full of politically charged men who are legally bypassing a military occupation.
But Sonichu wasn't his only influence. The second mentor is a man who looks and acts like he stepped right out of a mythological scroll, Yamaguchi Gogen.
Known throughout the martial arts world as the Cat, due to his long hair and his elusive feline movements, Yamaguchi Gogen was the de facto founder of the mainland Japanese branch of Goju-ryu karate.
And critically for our story, he was not just a martial artist.
No, he was an actual practicing Shugendo ascetic.
The accounts say Yamaguchi actively performed Takigyo, the freezing waterfall training, to forge his spirit in the mountains. And remarkably, just like Rikibasan, the Chakuriki master we talked about earlier, Yamaguchi Gogen was known to bend coins with his bare fingers.
Yes. His own son witnessed Oyama doing the exact same coin-bending feat as a party trick years later. It is a clear inheritance, a physical manifestation of internal power drawn from both his childhood memory of Chakuriki and his direct training under Shugendo ascetics like Yamaguchi.
Looking at Oyama's background, you can see why the mainstream karate scene in Tokyo would absolutely infuriate him.
Oh, he must have hated it.
You have a young man surrounded by these intense, politically radical, spiritually connected, physically terrifying men. He's learning close-quarters Goju Ryu, which is brutal, heavy, and highly practical. How did this environment influence his view of the polite university karate being championed by figures like Funakoshi Gichin, the founder of Shotokan?
It made him view mainstream karate as a dangerous delusion. Funakoshi and the university instructors were moving karate toward becoming a safe, sanitized sport. They were championing non-contact point sparring rules.
Which is very different from Oyama's background.
Funakoshi's philosophy was noble in theory. I mean, he believed that a true trained karate strike was far too lethal to ever actually land on a training partner. He believed in pulling the punch at the last possible millisecond. It was about breath control, precision, and character development, not bloodshed.
Which sounds great for a physical education curriculum. But for a guy who just spent his life learning how to survive wild beasts and underground bare-knuckle brawls, that sanitized sparring must have looked like absolute fantasy.
He famously derided non-contact sparring as a dance.
A dance.
Yeah, Oyama fundamentally believed that if you remove the physical reality of impact, if you remove the pain, the blood, and the biomechanical feedback of actually hitting a resisting human target, you completely remove the soul of the martial art.
He believed that without full contact, you are living in a fantasy world. And if you ever find yourself in a real fight for your life in an alleyway, that fantasy will get you killed. Oyama realized that polite point-sparring karate would get you killed. But he knew he couldn't just stand in Tokyo and preach about the virtues of bare-knuckle fighting. He had to embody it.
He had to prove it.
He had to prove that a human body could withstand that level of punishment. He had to synthesize the brutal close-quarters techniques of Goju Ryu with the mystical Chakuriki survivalism of his youth.
And to find that proof, he realized he had to do exactly what the Yamabushi did. He had to leave the comforts of the city, and he had to disappear into the mountains.
The sources detail how Oyama, fleeing some personal and political trouble involving U.S. military police in Tokyo, exiles himself to Mount Mitsumine in Chiba Prefecture.
Imagine being completely alone in a rough, uninsulated wooden cabin on a freezing Japanese mountain for months on end.
No electricity, no radio, no contact with the outside world.
You have nothing but your own mind and the elements. The psychological toll, the sheer sensory deprivation would break most people within a week. But Oyama isn't just surviving up there. He is actively utilizing the Shin and Ren pillars of Chakuriki and Shugendo.
The accounts say he would strike the trunks of living trees hundreds of times a day, day after day, until the bark was stripped completely bare and his own knuckles were a bloody, calcified mass of bone.
He was deliberately subjecting himself to Wolff's Law, systematically microfracturing his skeletal structure to forge denser bone.
He would leap over jagged rocks and fast-moving mountain streams to build explosive plyometric leg power. And following the direct path of his mentor Yamaguchi and the ancient ascetics, he stood under freezing mountain waterfalls to practice Takigyo.
He forced his heart rate down, calming his mind while his body was hammered by the freezing trauma of the water. He was literally, painfully forging his body into a weapon of nature.
When he finally descends from the mountain and returns to civilization in Tokyo, he is a fundamentally changed man. He has synthesized everything he learned.
And he opens his own training hall, initially called the Oyama Dojo, which would later be officially named the Kyokushin Kaikan.
Kyokushin, which translates beautifully to the ultimate truth.
And the truth he was offering the youth of post-war Japan was pain. The Oyama Dojo was a hyper-realistic, bare-knuckle, full-contact fight club.
There were no pulled punches. There was no protective gear. You fought until someone was knocked unconscious, had their ribs broken, or simply couldn't stand up anymore.
The traditional, polite university karate schools absolutely despised him for it. They looked at the bloody noses, the cracked femurs, and the missing teeth, and they mocked it as mere street fighting. They said it lacked dignity and the spirit of Budo.
Oyama didn't care about their approval or their idea of dignity. He was a pure pragmatist, and he didn't just stick to traditional karate techniques either.
Right. The sources point out a profound early synthesis happening in his dojo. He actively incorporated modern Western weightlifting to build raw muscular strength, which was highly taboo in traditional Asian martial arts circles at the time.
He incorporated judo sweeps, throws, and trips. He demanded real, resisting, full-contact combat sparring against different styles.
When you extrapolate what Oyama actually built in that Tokyo dojo, you realize he forged the very first truly modern mixed martial arts environment.
He took the Okinawan and Southern Chinese biomechanics of Goju-ryu, the concept of turning the extremities into hardened weapons, which we see in styles like Uechi-ryu and Panganun.
He combined that rigid structural hardening with the raw, nature-based survivalism of Korean Chakuriki, and he wrapped it all in the strict ascetic spiritual discipline of Japanese Shugendo.
He proved that to survive and dominate in brutal full-contact combat, you needed the elite biomechanics of a trice fighter and the unbreakable spiritual resilience of a mountain hermit.
This underground Tokyo Fight Club was so effective, producing fighters who were so undeniably powerful that it couldn't be contained on an island.
It was about to explode outward and change the combat sports landscape of the entire world. Kyokushin Karate begins to grow exponentially, and Oyama starts exporting his most talented, most aggressive, and most pragmatic students across the globe to spread his ultimate truth.
And one of the most critical geographical jumps in martial arts history happens when Kyokushin lands in Europe, specifically the Netherlands.
We have to talk about a man named Tom Harenk. Harenk is a Dutch martial artist who becomes completely obsessed with the brutal, uncompromising effectiveness of Kyokushin Karate.
He looks at what Oyama is doing and realizes it is the future of striking.
In 1972, Harenk decides to open his own kickboxing gym in Amsterdam. And he wants to name his gym something that honors the true, raw, unfiltered root of the power he is teaching.
He doesn't name it after a Dutch city, and he doesn't use a generic Japanese karate term.
Out of a profound historical respect for Mas Oyama's original, mystical inspiration as a 9-year-old boy in Manchuria, Tom Harenk names his gym Dojo Chakuriki.
Think about the magnitude of that for a second. If you follow global combat sports today, you know that Dutch kickboxing is universally feared and respected.
That's the standard.
The Dutch style, characterized by heavy, chopping low kicks that destroy the opponent's legs, a high, tight guard, and incredibly scientific, relentless boxing combinations, is a massive foundational pillar of modern MMA.
Champions like Bas Rutten, Ernesto Hoost, and Alistair Overeem all heavily rely on this Dutch striking lineage. The guys coming out of Amsterdam are absolute terminators in the ring.
And yet, one of the founding institutions of this highly scientific, modern European striking style is operating under a banner that technically translates to mountain-shaman magic.
It is the ultimate historical irony. You have these massive 250-pound tattooed Dutch fighters throwing scientifically perfect left hooks and leg kicks in million-dollar arenas, and their gym is named after an obscure Korean animist folk practice that involved eating rice cakes to cure village diseases and borrowing energy from the universe to fight off bears in the snow.
It perfectly illustrates how a single powerful idea, the idea of borrowing power, of optimizing the human structure far beyond its perceived biological limits, can transcend its original cultural context, survive decades of suppression, and evolve into something entirely new while still carrying the ghost of its ancient origin.
It is a beautiful, strange, full-circle journey. From a dusty harvest festival in Manchuria to the hallucinatory freezing peaks of Mount Mitsumine to an underground bare-knuckle dojo in occupied Tokyo, all the way to the bright lights and padded rings of modern Amsterdam kickboxing.
The DNA of the mountain ascetic is woven right into the very fabric of modern combat sports.
This history leaves us with a really important reflection. We live in an era where we rely almost entirely on external artificial means to optimize the human body.
Oh, completely. We train in hyper-sterilized gyms with climate control and padded floors.
We consume synthetic pre-workout supplements. We use wearable technology to track our heart rate variability down to the millisecond. We use biomechanical analysis software to correct our posture, and we follow specialized macronutrient diets.
We constantly try to hack our biology with comfort and technology.
But when you look at the legacy of Chakuriki, when you look at the terrifying endurance of the Yamabushi ascetics, and the sheer, undeniable, bone-crushing reality of Mas Oyama's Kyokushin, we have to ask a very difficult question.
What if true ultimate human potential simply cannot be unlocked in a sterile gym?
What if the only way to truly access the dormant 90% of our power is to step outside our comfort zones, to face the terrifying, raw, unpredictable elements of nature.
To stand under the freezing waterfall, to strike the tree, and to realize that we are deeply, inextricably connected to the earth beneath our feet.
It leaves you wondering, what other ancient borrowed powers have we completely forgotten in our rush toward modern comfort? What latent superhuman abilities are sleeping inside our nervous systems right now, just waiting for the right kind of extreme pressure to wake them up?
That is a heavy, fascinating thought to leave you with.
Next time you watch a modern MMA fight, or a kickboxing match, or even just drive past a local karate dojo in a strip mall, realize you aren't just looking at sports or recreation. You are witnessing the living, breathing echoes of ancient mountain survival tactics. You are seeing the shadow of the Chakuriki. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the everyday things around you. There is always a deeper layer to uncover.